They called her ancient F-4 Phantom a flying museum piece, and laughed when she taxied past their sleek F-35 Lightning jets. But Lieutenant Colonel Sarah "Ghost" Kellerman was about to remind an entire squadron that experience beats technology. Every single time. What happened next would silence every smirk, humble every ego, and prove that the most dangerous pilot in the sky was the one they'd all written off as yesterday's news. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning desert sun blazed mercilessly across Thunderbolt Air Force Base in Nevada as Colonel Kellerman performed her pre-flight inspection on the weathered McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II that had been her companion for the past 18 months. The aircraft's gray paint was faded and patched in dozens of places, bearing the scars of 3 decades of service across multiple conflicts and training exercises. Her gloved hands moved with practiced precision across every rivet, every access panel, every surface that could mean the difference between life and death at 30,000 feet. At 52 years old, Sarah Kellerman possessed more actual combat flying hours than the rest of Blue Squadron combined. 28 years of military service had taken her through the skies over Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and half a dozen classified operations that would never appear in any official record. She'd flown everything from close air support missions to deep reconnaissance flights behind enemy lines, accumulating decorations and commendations that filled an entire wall of her small apartment off base. Yet here she stood, assigned to what the younger pilots mockingly called the Antique Division, flying a fighter jet that had first taken to the skies when most of her squadron mates were still in diapers. The F-4 Phantom had been cutting-edge technology in 1958, a twin-engine, twin-seat fighter bomber that had dominated air combat throughout the Cold War era. Now in an age of stealth technology, advanced avionics, and computer-assisted everything, her aircraft was considered a relic. Major Jessica Torres, Blue Squadron's executive officer and 15 years Sarah's junior, walked past with her flight suit pristine and her helmet tucked under her arm. She glanced at the Phantom with barely concealed disdain before addressing Sarah with the kind of forced politeness that barely masked condescension. "Still babying the museum piece, Colonel?" Torres commented, her voice carrying across the flight line. "I saw the maintenance reports from yesterday's flight. Another hydraulic leak, another avionics glitch, another reason why that bird should be in a display case instead of on active duty." Sarah continued her inspection, running her fingers along the leading edge of the port wing where tiny stress fractures had been expertly welded and reinforced. "This aircraft has more reliable flight hours logged than your entire generation of pilots has simulator time, Major. Sometimes experience trumps flash." Torres laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Experience doesn't overcome physics, Colonel. My Lightning can fly circles around that Antique while simultaneously tracking 12 targets and engaging 6 simultaneously. Your Phantom can barely maintain lock-on with one." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Marcus Webb, the squadron's youngest pilot and arguably its most arrogant. At 26, Webb had graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy and had never flown anything but the most advanced aircraft the military could provide. His F-35 Lightning II represented the pinnacle of modern air superiority technology, equipped with stealth capabilities, advanced radar systems, and weapons guidance computers that could engage targets beyond visual range with devastating accuracy. Ladies, Webb interjected with a grin that didn't quite hide his smugness. "No need to argue about whose ride is better. We all know the score here." He gestured toward Sarah's Phantom with theatrical disdain. "That flying fossil belongs in the Smithsonian, not on an active flight line with real fighters." Sarah straightened up from her inspection, her green eyes steady as she met Webb's gaze. "Captain, I was flying combat missions when you were learning to tie your shoes." This fossil has more confirmed kills than your entire career has training sorties. Confirmed kills against what? Webb shot back. MiGs from the 1970s? SAM sights that couldn't track a crop duster? Come on, Colonel. Modern warfare requires modern tools. Your bird might have been impressive when disco was popular, but this is the 21st century. The group was joined by Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, the base commander, who'd been observing the exchange from across the flight line. Rodriguez was a career military man who'd worked his way up through the ranks, but his recent promotion had come largely due to his ability to manage budgets and maintain political relationships rather than his prowess in the cockpit. He'd flown transport missions during the tail end of the Iraq War, accumulating just enough flight hours to maintain his pilot's rating while spending most of his time behind a desk. Kellerman, Rodriguez called out, approaching with the kind of measured stride that suggested official business. I need to speak with you about your assignment for today's exercise. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. For the past 18 months, since her transfer to Thunderbolt, she'd been systematically excluded from the squadron's most challenging training exercises. While pilots like Webb and Torres flew complex air-to-air combat scenarios and advanced tactical missions, she'd been relegated to basic flight pattern drills and equipment familiarization, flights that were typically assigned to rookie pilots. Fresh out of flight school, what kind of assignment, sir? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be what she hoped. Weather reconnaissance over the southern training range, Rodriguez replied, consulting his clipboard. Visibility checks, wind pattern analysis, basic atmospheric data collection. Should take about 2 hours, nice and simple. Torres and Webb exchanged glances, barely suppressing smirks. Weather reconnaissance was the kind of mission typically assigned to transport pilots or junior officers who needed to log flight hours without being trusted with anything operationally significant. For a pilot of Sarah's experience and rank, it was the aerial equivalent of being asked to sweep the hangar floor. Sir, Sarah said carefully, my flight qualifications include advanced air-to-air combat certification, close air support specialization, and tactical reconnaissance authorization. I'm qualified for any mission this squadron flies. Of course you are, Colonel, Rodriguez replied in the tone one might use when humoring a child. But today's advanced tactical exercise requires pilots who are current on modern avionics and weapons systems. Your aircraft lacks the technological compatibility for integrated squadron operations. What he didn't say, but what everyone present understood, was that Sarah's Phantom was considered a liability in modern combat scenarios. Its lack of stealth capability, its limited electronic warfare systems, and its older radar technology made it unsuitable for the kind of coordinated, high-tech combat that defined contemporary military aviation doctrine. Sarah had heard variations of this explanation dozens of times over the past year and a half. Always delivered with professional courtesy, always technically accurate, always designed to keep her flying solo missions while the rest of the squadron trained together as a unit. She'd gone from being a respected combat veteran to being treated like an expensive liability that command was obligated to keep airborne until her retirement papers could be processed. As the morning briefing dispersed and the younger pilots headed toward their modern aircraft, Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had kept her alive through hundreds of combat missions. Every system check, every control surface examination, every fuel line inspection was performed with the kind of attention to detail that came from understanding that mechanical failure at altitude wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The truth that none of her squadron mates understood was that flying an older aircraft required skills they'd never had to develop. Modern fighters were designed to compensate for pilot error, to automate complex calculations, to make split-second decisions that allowed even mediocre pilots to perform at acceptable levels. Sarah's Phantom demanded that she be better than her aircraft, that she understand every system intimately, that she make up for technological limitations with superior skill and experience. She climbed into the cockpit of her F-4, settling into the ejection seat that had been custom fitted to her specifications over years of flying. The familiar smell of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and worn leather surrounded her like an old friend's embrace. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with unconscious precision, starting engines that responded with the distinctive whine of Pratt & Whitney J79 turbojets that had been powering military aircraft since before most of her squadron mates were born. As she taxied toward the active runway, Sarah passed the line of gleaming F-35 Lightning II fighters that represented the future of air combat. Their pilots were already strapped in, running through computerized pre-flight checklists, displayed on high-resolution screens that provided more information than Sarah's entire instrument panel could display. She could see Webb in his cockpit, probably reviewing targeting algorithms and electronic warfare protocols that his aircraft would execute automatically during flight. None of them understood that in just a few hours, an emergency would arise that would strip away all their technological advantages and reduce air combat to its most fundamental elements: pilot skill, situational awareness, and the kind of flying instincts that could only be developed through years of actual combat experience. The systematic marginalization of experienced pilots like Sarah Kellerman wasn't accidental, it was institutional policy disguised as modernization. 3 weeks earlier, she'd sat in the sterile conference room of Building 47, listening to General Patricia Hawkins deliver a presentation titled Force Structure Optimization for Next Generation Warfare to a gathering of senior officers from across the command. General Hawkins, a sharp-faced woman in her early 40s, who'd risen through the ranks during the height of the technological revolution in military aviation, clicked through slides showing cost-benefit analyses, maintenance expenditure projections, and pilot efficiency metrics. Every chart, every graph, every statistical breakdown pointed toward the same conclusion: older aircraft and their pilots were becoming economically and tactically obsolete. The data is unambiguous, Hawkins had declared, her laser pointer highlighting a particularly damning set of numbers. Pilots over age 45 showed decreased reaction times, reduced adaptability to new technologies, and significantly higher resistance to integrated combat systems. Meanwhile, maintenance costs for legacy aircraft have increased by 300% over the past 5 years. Sarah had raised her hand during the question period, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. General, those statistics don't account for combat experience differentials. Older pilots have logged actual combat hours that can't be replicated in simulation training. Hawkins had smiled with the patronizing warmth of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. Colonel Kellerman, we appreciate the historical value of combat experience. However, modern warfare has evolved beyond the scope of traditional dogfighting and close-quarters engagement. Today's conflicts are fought with beyond visual range weapon systems, stealth technology, and computer-assisted targeting that renders individual pilot experience largely irrelevant. The room had fallen silent as the implications sank in. Decades of hard-earned flying skills, thousands of hours of combat experience, and the kind of situational awareness that could only be developed through actual life-or-death encounters were being dismissed as obsolete curiosities. The new Air Force valued technological proficiency over human expertise, computer algorithms over pilot instinct. Colonel Rodriguez had nodded enthusiastically throughout Hawkins' presentation, taking notes and asking questions that demonstrated his complete buy-in to the modernization philosophy. As base commander, he'd implemented policies that systematically favored younger pilots flying newer aircraft, creating assignment rotations that effectively quarantined older pilots like Sarah from meaningful mission opportunities. The legacy pilot integration protocol had been Rodriguez's brainchild, A bureaucratic masterpiece that appeared to value experience while actually limiting its application. Under this system, pilots flying older aircraft were assigned to support roles, training missions, and administrative duties that kept them airborne just enough to maintain their flight status while preventing them from participating in operationally significant exercises. Major Torres had become Rodriguez's unofficial enforcer of this policy, using her position as executive officer to ensure that mission assignments consistently favored pilots flying modern aircraft. During weekly planning meetings, she would review pilot qualifications and aircraft capabilities with a checklist that systematically excluded older platforms from challenging assignments. Colonel Kellerman's Phantom lacks the data link connectivity required for multi-platform coordination, Torres would note in her reports. Technically accurate but practically devastating. Recommend assignment to independent reconnaissance missions pending aircraft modernization or pilot transition to current generation platforms. The phrase pending pilot transition had become a euphemism for forced retirement. The Air Force had made it clear that pilots unwilling or unable to adapt to newer aircraft would find their career advancement opportunities severely limited. Several of Sarah's contemporaries had already accepted early retirement packages rather than endure the professional humiliation of being sidelined. Captain Webb represented the new generation of pilots who'd never known anything but technological superiority. His flight training had taken place entirely on advanced simulators and modern aircraft equipped with computer systems that could compensate for pilot error and automate complex combat decisions. To him and his peers, pilots like Sarah weren't experienced veterans, they were anachronisms, clinging to outdated methods that had been superseded by superior technology. The younger pilots had developed their own informal hierarchy that completely bypassed traditional military rank structure. They formed study groups focused on advanced avionics, shared tactics for maximizing their aircraft's technological capabilities, and socialized together in ways that excluded older pilots. Webb had organized Lightning Squadron gatherings at off-base restaurants where F-35 pilots would discuss missions and share techniques while pointedly not inviting pilots flying older aircraft. This social ostracism extended into professional relationships as well. During mission briefings, younger pilots would discuss tactical coordination and mutual support as if Sarah's Phantom simply didn't exist as a potential asset. They'd plan formations, establish communication protocols, and coordinate weapons engagement sequences without considering how an experienced pilot in an older aircraft might contribute to mission success. The maintenance department had internalized these priorities as well. Chief Master Sergeant David Park, who supervised aircraft maintenance across the base, had restructured his scheduling to prioritize newer aircraft. Parts orders, repair schedules, and upgrade installations consistently favored the F-35 fleet, while older aircraft like Sarah's Phantom received minimal attention beyond basic airworthiness requirements. Limited parts availability for legacy platforms. Park would explain when Sarah's aircraft experienced extended maintenance delays. Manufacturer support has shifted to current generation systems. We're doing our best with what we have, but the reality is that these older birds aren't the priority anymore. Sarah had discovered through informal conversations with maintenance technicians that this wasn't entirely accurate. Parts were available, but procurement procedures had been modified to create bureaucratic delays for older aircraft. Purchase orders required additional approval levels, delivery schedules were given lower priority, and installation work was consistently scheduled after higher priority. Maintenance on newer platforms. The training schedule itself had been restructured to favor pilots flying modern aircraft. Advanced combat exercises, tactical scenario training, and joint operations with other military branches were increasingly designed around capabilities that only newer aircraft possessed. Older platforms were systematically excluded from these exercises. ostensibly due to technological incompatibility, but practically resulting in the professional isolation of their pilots. Even the performance evaluation system had been modified to emphasize technological proficiency over traditional flying skills. Pilots were now rated on their ability to operate advanced avionics systems, integrate with computer-assisted targeting platforms, and maximize their aircraft's electronic warfare capabilities. Traditional measures of pilot skill, stick and rudder, flying ability, situational awareness, and combat instincts had been relegated to secondary importance. Sarah's recent fitness reports reflected this bias clearly. Despite consistently excellent ratings in traditional flying categories, her overall scores had declined due to low marks in technological adaptation and systems integration capability. Comments from supervisors praised her experience while simultaneously noting her limited growth potential in modern combat environments. The message was clear: adapt to new technology or accept professional irrelevance. The Air Force had decided that the future belonged to pilots who could maximize the capabilities of advanced aircraft, not to veterans who'd proven themselves in actual combat, but struggled with computer interfaces and automated systems. What the architects of this policy failed to understand was that they were creating a military aviation culture that valued technological dependence over pilot independence, computer assistance over human judgment, and theoretical capability over proven performance. They'd built a system that could function perfectly under ideal conditions, but had never been tested when technology failed and human skill became the only thing standing between mission success and catastrophic failure. That test was the incident that would define Sarah Kellerman's reputation at Thunderbolt Air Force Base began on a Tuesday morning in March during the pre-flight briefing for Operation Desert Thunder, a large-scale training exercise designed to test the squadron's ability to coordinate multiple aircraft in a simulated combat environment. The briefing room hummed with the excited chatter of pilots eager to demonstrate their skills in the most complex training scenario the base had conducted in months. Colonel Rodriguez stood at the front of the room, pointing to a large tactical display showing the exercise parameters. 24 aircraft from 3 different squadrons would participate in a mock air-to-air engagement over the Nellis Range, with half the planes acting as aggressor forces and the others defending a simulated high-value target. The exercise would test everything from individual pilot skills to squadron-level coordination and electronic warfare capabilities. Weather conditions are forecast to be challenging, Rodriguez announced, consulting his briefing notes. We're looking at high winds aloft, potential turbulence at mission altitude, and scattered cloud formations that could affect visual acquisition. However, our F-35's advanced radar systems and helmet-mounted displays should provide adequate situational awareness regardless of atmospheric conditions. Sarah studied the meteorological data on her briefing packet with growing concern. The weather forecast showed wind shear patterns and atmospheric instability that her experience told her would create significant challenges for aircraft operations. More troubling were the electromagnetic interference readings that suggested potential problems with radio communications and radar systems. She raised her hand. "Sir, I'm seeing some concerning data in the atmospheric electromagnetic readings. Those interference patterns could significantly degrade radar performance and radio communications, especially for aircraft operating at the planned mission altitudes." Rodriguez glanced at the data briefly before dismissing her concern with a wave. "Colonel, our modern avionics systems are designed to operate effectively in electronic warfare environments, far more challenging than anything natural atmospheric conditions can produce. The F-35's radar systems can adapt automatically to interference patterns." Captain Webb leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Besides, those electromagnetic readings are probably just background noise from the old radar systems on the base. Our birds can filter out that kind of static automatically." Sarah persisted, her voice calm but insistent. Sir, I've flown in similar atmospheric conditions over Afghanistan. The electromagnetic interference isn't random. It follows specific patterns that can create radar shadows and communication dead zones. I recommend we modify the mission parameters to account for potential system degradation. Major Torres consulted her tablet, scrolling through technical specifications. The mission planning software has already analyzed atmospheric conditions and determined OPTIM-L flight paths for maximum system effectiveness. The computers have accounted for all environmental variables. Computers can analyze data, Sarah replied, but they can't replicate 28 years of flying experience in challenging conditions. Those interference patterns will create specific blind spots in radar coverage that could compromise the exercise and potentially create safety hazards. The room had grown quiet as other pilots sensed the tension building between Sarah and the command staff. Several younger pilots exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion that the old-timer was once again trying to insert her obsolete experience into a situation that modern technology had already solved. Colonel Rodriguez's expression had hardened. Colonel Kellerman, I appreciate your historical perspective on these matters. However, this exercise has been planned using the most advanced meteorological analysis software available. The mission parameters were developed by specialists who understand the capabilities of modern aircraft systems. I think we can trust their expertise over weather folklore. The dismissive use of weather folklore stung, but Sarah pressed forward. Sir, this isn't folklore. I'm looking at specific electromagnetic signature patterns that indicate atmospheric ducting effects. These conditions will create radar anomalies between 15 and 25,000 feet that could result in aircraft losing contact with ground control and with each other. Webb had heard enough. Colonel, with respect, your aircraft doesn't even have the radar systems to detect the kind of interference you're talking about. How can you possibly know more about radar performance than the computers that designed our mission profile? Because I've flown through electromagnetic storms before, Captain. I've seen what happens when atmospheric conditions overwhelm electronic systems, and I've watched good pilots get into serious trouble when they trusted their computers instead of their instruments and their instincts. Rodriguez closed his briefing folder with finality. The mission proceeds as planned. All aircraft will maintain standard formation protocols and follow briefed communication procedures. Colonel Kellerman, since you're clearly concerned about electromagnetic interference, perhaps you should remain at lower altitude for your reconnaissance mission to avoid any potential complications. The meeting ended with Sarah once again relegated to a peripheral role while the main exercise continued. Without her input, as the pilots filed out to their aircraft, she heard Webb mutter to Torres, "Someone needs to explain to Grandma that this isn't the Korean War anymore." 2 hours later, the exercise began according to plan. Sarah conducted her assigned weather reconnaissance mission at 12,000 feet, staying well below the altitudes where she knew the electromagnetic interference would be most severe. Through her radio, she monitored the exercise communications as 23 modern fighters climbed to their assigned positions for the mock combat engagement. At first, everything proceeded normally. The various squadrons checked in with ground control, established their formations, and began the complex aerial choreography of simulated air-to-air combat. Sarah could hear the excitement in the younger pilots' voices as they engaged their targets and maneuvered through the exercise scenarios. Then, at exactly 18,000 feet, the electromagnetic interference began affecting their systems. Precisely as Sarah had predicted. The first sign of trouble came when Captain Webb's voice crackled through the radio with obvious frustration. "Ground control, Lightning 4, I'm showing multiple false contacts on radar. My system is tracking targets that aren't there." Within minutes, other pilots were reporting similar problems. Radar systems were generating ghost contacts, Communication channels were experiencing significant static, and several aircraft had lost data link connectivity with ground control. The sophisticated electronic systems that were supposed to make the exercise foolproof were failing exactly as Sarah had warned they would. Major Torres' voice came through the radio, tense with growing alarm. Ground control, Blue Leader. We've lost positive identification on multiple aircraft. Recommend we abort the exercise until we can resolve these system malfunctions. But it was too late. In the confusion created by degraded radar and communication systems, two F-35s nearly collided while maneuvering to engage what their computers insisted were enemy aircraft, but were actually other friendly fighters, whose electronic signatures had been distorted by the atmospheric interference. Only emergency evasive maneuvers and sheer luck prevented a catastrophic mid-air collision that could have killed both pilots. Ground control immediately called a halt to the exercise, ordering all aircraft to return to base using emergency protocols. As the squadron landed and pilots climbed out of their cockpits, the post-flight debriefing revealed the full scope of what had gone wrong. Every single aircraft flying above 15,000 feet had experienced significant system degradation, communication problems, and radar malfunctions. Colonel Rodriguez convened an immediate investigation to determine the cause of the equipment failures. Teams of technicians swarmed over the aircraft, checking systems and running diagnostics to identify what had gone wrong with millions of dollars worth of advanced avionics equipment. When the investigation concluded 3 days later, the official report attributed the problems to unforeseen electromagnetic anomalies and equipment performance degradation under unusual atmospheric conditions. The report recommended additional training for pilots on manual flight procedures and backup communication protocols. What the report didn't mention was that Colonel Sarah Kellerman had predicted exactly these problems 3 days before they occurred. What it didn't acknowledge was that her warning had been dismissed as obsolete thinking from a pilot clinging to outdated methods. What it certainly didn't include was any suggestion that maybe, just maybe, experience sometimes knew things that computers couldn't calculate. Instead, Sarah found herself facing informal suggestions that her alarmist warnings had contributed to pilot anxiety and potentially compromised the exercise before it even began. The very prediction that had proven accurate was now being characterized as disruptive and unprofessional. Once again, being right had somehow made her wrong. The retaliation against Sarah began subtly, wrapped in the language of administrative efficiency and operational optimization. Within a week of the electromagnetic interference incident, she found herself removed from the routine weekly flight schedule that governed pilot assignments across the base. Her name simply disappeared from the rotation board in the operations center, replaced by a notation that read, "Special assignment pending administrative review." Major Torres delivered the news during what was ostensibly a routine check-in meeting, her tone carefully neutral as she explained the new arrangement. "Colonel, Command has decided to reassign you to aircraft systems evaluation duties while we review training protocols following the recent exercise complications. It's a temporary measure to ensure optimal squadron integration moving forward." The phrase "exercise complications" had become the official euphemism for the near-catastrophic system failures that Sarah had accurately predicted. Rather than acknowledging her expertise, the command structure had chosen to treat her warning as somehow contributory to the problem itself. The logic was twisted but institutionally convenient. If she hadn't raised concerns about electromagnetic interference, the pilots might have approached the exercise with more confidence and achieved better results. Sarah's new duties involved conducting solo flight tests on aircraft returning from major maintenance, essentially acting as a test pilot for repairs and modifications that didn't require the attention of pilots, flying operationally significant missions. While this work was technically important, it effectively isolated her from the squadron's primary activities and eliminated any opportunity for her to demonstrate her capabilities in challenging scenarios. The first aircraft assigned to her for evaluation testing was an F-16 Fighting Falcon that had undergone engine replacement. The maintenance work was routine, but regulations required a qualified pilot to verify that all systems were functioning properly before the aircraft could return to active duty. Sarah conducted the test flight with her characteristic thoroughness, identifying 3 minor issues that required additional attention before the aircraft could be certified airworthy. Her detailed post-flight report documented hydraulic pressure, fluctuations during high-G maneuvers, intermittent radio static on specific frequencies, and slight control surface lag during rapid roll transitions. All 3 issues were within acceptable parameters, but represented potential problems that could worsen over time without proper attention. Chief Master Sergeant Park reviewed her report with obvious reluctance, clearly frustrated by the additional work her findings would require. Colonel, these are all within normal tolerances. The aircraft meets all safety specifications and readiness requirements. The specifications represent minimum acceptable performance, Sarah replied. These issues indicate developing problems that could affect mission effectiveness if left unaddressed. I recommend corrective maintenance before returning this bird to flight status. Park's expression suggested he was dealing with an unreasonably demanding customer rather than a pilot trying to ensure aircraft safety. Colonel, with respect, we have limited maintenance capacity and a full schedule of higher priority work. These minor issues don't justify delaying this aircraft's return to service. The conversation exemplified a broader pattern that had emerged. Since Sarah's electromagnetic interference prediction proved accurate, her technical expertise was now being characterized as excessive perfectionism, her attention to detail dismissed as obsessive nitpicking. The same qualities that had once been valued as professional excellence were being reframed as disruptive behaviors that complicated efficient operations. Captain Webb had become particularly vocal in his criticism of what he called Sarah's hypercritical approach to aircraft evaluation. During informal conversations in the squadron-ready room, he would regale other pilots with exaggerated accounts of her maintenance requirements and technical concerns. She wants us to rebuild every aircraft from scratch, Webb complained to a group of younger pilots. Yesterday she grounded an F-16 because of hydraulic pressure fluctuations that were barely detectable. At this rate, we'll never have enough aircraft available for actual training missions. These conversations always seemed to occur when Sarah was within earshot, but not directly included in the discussion. The younger pilots would nod sympathetically, while glancing in her direction, creating an atmosphere of social isolation that made her presence in common areas increasingly uncomfortable. The exclusion extended to professional development opportunities as well. Advanced training courses, tactical conferences, and specialized certification programs were increasingly assigned to pilots flying newer aircraft. When Sarah inquired about attending the Combat Tactics Symposium at Nellis Air Force Base, Major Torres explained that attendance was limited to pilots current on modern avionics systems. The symposium focuses primarily on integrated warfare techniques that require advanced sensor fusion and data link capabilities, Torres explained. Since your aircraft lacks these systems, the training wouldn't be directly applicable to your current mission profile. This reasoning was technically accurate, but professionally devastating. Sarah's exclusion from advanced training was justified by her assignment to older aircraft, while her assignment to older aircraft was justified by her exclusion from advanced training. The circular logic created an inescapable trap that ensured her continued marginalization. Regardless of her actual capabilities, even her physical workspace reflected her diminished status within the squadron. Her assigned desk in the pilot-ready room was relocated to a corner position where she could observe, but not easily participate in the informal discussions that shaped squadron culture. Her name was removed from the duty roster board and the mission assignment displays that tracked pilot activities and availability. The administrative isolation was accompanied by a systematic erosion of her operational responsibilities. Flight authorizations that had once been processed automatically now required additional approvals and documentation. Mission requests submitted through normal channels were consistently returned with requests for additional justification or alternative approaches. When Sarah proposed conducting advanced maneuvering training in her F-4 Phantom to maintain her combat readiness, Colonel Rodriguez rejected the request on grounds of resource optimization and safety considerations. The explanation noted that solo training flights in older aircraft created unnecessary maintenance expenses without contributing to squadron operational capabilities. The message was clear. Sarah's flying skills were no longer considered valuable enough to justify the cost of keeping her aircraft operational. Her decades of experience were being treated as expensive indulgences rather than strategic assets. The Air Force was systematically divesting itself of pilots like her in favor of younger personnel who could maximize the capabilities of modern technology. Her performance evaluations reflected this institutional bias with bureaucratic precision. While her technical ratings remained high, new categories had been added that consistently scored her poorly. Adaptability to emerging technologies, integration with modern combat systems, and collaborative effectiveness in digital environments all received ratings that dragged down her overall assessment. The evaluation comments were particularly insidious, combining faint praise with subtle criticism that painted her expertise as a liability. Colonel Kellerman demonstrates exceptional technical knowledge of aircraft systems and superior manual flying skills. However, her resistance to modernization initiatives and tendency to question established procedures may limit her effectiveness in contemporary operational environments. The phrase resistance to modernization had become code for any pilot who raised concerns about over-reliance on technology or questioned computer-generated solutions to complex problems. Sarah's accurate predictions about system vulnerabilities were being reframed as evidence of her inability to adapt to modern military aviation. Personal relationships within the squadron deteriorated as younger pilots internalized the commands. Assessment of her value. Conversations that had once included her naturally now continued without her input. Professional courtesies were maintained, but the easy camaraderie that characterized military aviation culture gradually excluded her from meaningful participation. The isolation was psychological as much as professional. Sarah found herself questioning her own judgment, wondering if perhaps the critics were right about her inability to adapt to modern warfare. The constant pressure to accept diminished expectations was wearing down her confidence in ways that enemy fire had never managed to accomplish. Yet every morning, she continued her meticulous aircraft inspections, maintained her physical fitness standards, and studied technical manuals with the same dedication that had characterized her entire career. She refused to accept that experience had become obsolete, even as the institution around her insisted that her time had passed. Sarah's alarm clock buzzed at 0430 hours every morning, 90 minutes before the official start of duty hours at Thunderbolt Air Force Base. While her squadron mates slept peacefully in their quarters, she made her way through the pre-dawn darkness to Hangar 12, a maintenance facility on the far side of the airfield that housed decommissioned aircraft and surplus equipment. Hidden among the covered hulks of retired fighters was a secret that none of her colleagues suspected. 3 months earlier, Sarah had discovered an intact flight simulator buried beneath dust covers and obsolete spare parts. The Link Trainer had been built in the 1990s and represented cutting-edge technology for its era, though it was now considered hopelessly outdated compared to the virtual reality systems used to train modern pilots. Most importantly, it still functioned, and its databases contained tactical scenarios that had been developed during actual combat operations rather than theoretical exercises. working entirely during off-duty hours. Sarah had spent weeks restoring the simulator to operational condition. She'd scavenged replacement components from other decommissioned equipment, repaired circuit boards using techniques learned from decades of maintaining her own aircraft, and even rewired sections of the control system using maintenance manuals she'd acquired through unofficial channels. The simulator's software library contained hundreds of combat scenarios based on real engagements from conflicts spanning 3 decades. Unlike the sanitized training programs used in modern systems, these scenarios included the chaos, uncertainty, and equipment failures that characterized actual warfare. They required pilots to succeed despite technological limitations rather than because of technological advantages. Each morning, Sarah would spend 2 hours in the simulator, flying missions that challenged every aspect of her piloting skills. She practiced air-to-air combat without the benefit of advanced radar systems, conducted ground attack missions using visual navigation and manual target acquisition, and rehearsed emergency procedures that assumed all electronic systems had failed. The scenarios forced her to rely on fundamental flying skills that younger pilots had never needed to develop. Without automated targeting systems, she had to calculate firing solutions manually while maneuvering at high speed. Without digital navigation aids, she learned to navigate using landmark recognition and dead reckoning techniques. Without electronic countermeasures, she developed tactics for evading threats through superior maneuvering rather than technological jamming. Preparing and narrating this type of story took U.S. long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. These training sessions were supplemented by exhaustive study of combat tactics developed during pre-digital warfare eras. Sarah had collected technical manuals, after-action reports, and tactical analyses from conflicts where pilots succeeded through skill rather than technological superiority. She studied the techniques used by ace pilots during the Korean War, analyzed engagement tactics from Vietnam-era combat, and absorbed lessons learned from air battles where victory went to the most skilled rather than the most technologically advanced. Her physical conditioning regimen exceeded Air Force standards by significant margins. While pilots flying modern aircraft could rely on computer assistance for many maneuvers, Sarah's F-4 Phantom demanded superior physical strength and endurance to handle the aircraft's demanding flight characteristics. She maintained a training schedule that would have challenged pilots half her age, focusing on the core strength and G-force tolerance necessary for high performance. Maneuvering without computer assistance, the weekend hours she spent in her aircraft represented the most intensive training of all. Away from the scrutiny of squadron leadership, Sarah pushed her F-4 through maneuvers that demonstrated capabilities her colleagues never suspected existed. She practiced air combat maneuvering techniques that exploited her aircraft's unique characteristics, developed energy management strategies that maximize performance despite technological limitations, and refined flying skills that could compensate for the absence of modern avionics. Her logbook entries for these training flights were carefully crafted to appear routine while concealing the advanced nature of her activities. Aircraft familiarization covered tactical maneuvering practice, systems evaluation disguised air combat training, performance verification hid aerobatic sequences designed to maintain her edge in high-stress situations. Between official duties, Sarah immersed herself in technical literature that most pilots considered obsolete. She studied the aerodynamic principles that governed aircraft performance before computer-assisted flight controls, learned the mathematical calculations that pilots once performed manually during combat, and mastered the navigation techniques that had guided military aviators before GPS systems made such knowledge seemingly unnecessary. Her quarters contained a private library of aviation texts that spanned the entire history of military flight. Books on World War II combat tactics sat beside manuals for jet era fighters. while detailed studies of air-to-air engagement strategies from multiple conflicts provided insights that no modern training program could replicate. She approached this material with the dedication of a graduate student, preparing for comprehensive examinations, taking notes and developing personal reference guides that distilled decades of combat experience into actionable knowledge. The psychological isolation imposed by her squadron's dismissive attitude had an unexpected benefit. It freed her from the groupthink that constrained younger pilots' tactical development. While they focused on maximizing their aircraft's technological advantages, Sarah explored combat strategies that remained effective regardless of technological sophistication. She developed approaches to air warfare that emphasized pilot skill over electronic superiority, human judgment over computer algorithms. Her maintenance expertise provided another layer of preparation that her colleagues couldn't match. Sarah understood her F-4 Phantom at a level that exceeded even the aircraft's original designer's intentions. She knew which systems could be pushed beyond their official limits, which components would fail under specific stress conditions, and how to extract maximum performance from aging equipment through superior technique rather than technological enhancement. This intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities allowed her to develop flying techniques that were specifically optimized for her equipment's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. She learned to use the F-4's superior thrust-to-weight ratio to overcome its lack of modern avionics, employed its exceptional structural strength to perform maneuvers that would stress newer aircraft, and exploited its simple systems architecture to maintain operational effectiveness when electronic warfare would disable more complex platforms. Late at night, after completing her official duties and her secret training sessions, Sarah would review tactical scenarios and combat analyses, always searching for opportunities to apply lessons learned from aviation history to contemporary challenges. She developed contingency plans for situations that modern doctrine assumed would never occur, prepared for combat conditions that computer models suggested were impossible, and maintained readiness for challenges that institutional wisdom insisted were obsolete. None of her squadron mates suspected that the pilot they'd written off as technologically obsolete was actually the most comprehensively prepared aviator on the base. Her opportunity to prove that superior skill could triumph over advanced technology was approaching faster than anyone imagined. The crisis began at 13:47 hours on a Thursday afternoon when Sergeant First Class Maria Santos burst into the squadron ready room with the kind of expression that immediately commanded attention from every pilot present. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled urgency as she announced that ground control had received an emergency transmission from a civilian aircraft in severe distress approximately 200 miles northwest of the base. "We've got a Cessna Citation business jet with 8 souls on board, including 2 children," Santos reported, consulting her emergency notification tablet. The aircraft suffered catastrophic electrical failure during severe weather and has been flying blind for the past 20 minutes. They're running low on fuel and need immediate assistance for emergency landing procedures. Colonel Rodriguez emerged from his office, moving with the crisp efficiency that emergency situations demanded. "What's their current position and status?" "Last known coordinates put them over the Painted Desert region, flying erratic headings between 8 and 12,000 feet, Santos replied. The pilot managed to get one transmission through before losing all communication capability. They have no navigation systems, no radar, no radio contact, and approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining. The ready room erupted into controlled chaos as pilots began calculating flight times, fuel requirements, and rescue coordination procedures. Captain Webb was already reaching for his flight gear when Rodriguez held up a hand to establish order among the responding personnel. "We need immediate SAR coordination with civilian aircraft assistance," Rodriguez announced. "Webb, Torres, and Mitchell will launch immediately to establish visual contact and provide navigation assistance for emergency landing at the nearest suitable airfield. The 3 pilots designated for the mission hurried toward their F-35 Lightning II fighters, their advanced radar systems and communication equipment, representing the obvious choice for locating and assisting a lost civilian aircraft. Their planes contained the most sophisticated search and rescue technology available, with thermal imaging systems that could detect aircraft signatures at extreme ranges and secure communication systems that could coordinate with multiple agencies. Simultaneously, Sarah watched the launch preparations from her corner desk, mentally calculating the challenges that lay ahead for the rescue mission. The Painted Desert region was notorious for its electromagnetic interference patterns, the same atmospheric conditions that had caused problems during the training exercise 3 weeks earlier. More concerning was the severe weather system currently moving through the area, generating the kind of electrical activity that could disable modern avionics systems. 20 minutes after takeoff, Captain Webb's voice crackled through the base radio system with obvious frustration and growing concern. Ground Control, Lightning Flight Lead, we're experiencing significant system degradation at search altitude. Electronic interference is affecting radar performance and communication systems. Colonel Rodriguez moved to the communication center, his expression darkening as he realized the implications of Webb's report. Lightning Lead, clarify your status. Are you able to maintain search operations? Negative, Ground Control, Webb replied, his voice distorted by static. We're getting false contacts on radar, intermittent navigation system failures, and communication blackouts lasting several minutes at a time. The interference patterns are too severe for effective search operations using our electronic systems. Major. Torres' voice joined the radio traffic, confirming the scope of the problem. Ground Control, Lightning II, we're showing multiple ghost targets and losing GPS lock intermittently. Our systems are being overwhelmed by electromagnetic interference from the storm system. The situation was rapidly becoming a nightmare scenario for modern military aviation. The same advanced technology that made the F-35s incredibly capable under normal conditions was rendering them ineffective in the electromagnetic chaos of the severe weather system. Their sophisticated radar systems were generating false readings, their GPS navigation was unreliable, and their communication equipment was failing when it was needed most. Meanwhile, somewhere in the desert, 8 people, including 2 children, were flying blind through severe weather with diminishing fuel supplies and no way to communicate their location or condition. Every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival as their aircraft consumed precious fuel while flying erratic patterns without navigation assistance. Colonel Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. His most advanced aircraft were unable to function effectively in the search area due to electronic interference that their systems couldn't overcome. The civilian aircraft needed immediate assistance that conventional SAR methods couldn't provide given the communication blackouts and navigation system failures affecting the rescue aircraft. "Sir," Sergeant Santos said quietly, approaching Rodriguez with additional information that had just arrived. "We've received updated weather reports from the National Weather Service. The electromagnetic interference is intensifying and expected to continue for at least 2 more hours. Modern avionics systems will be severely compromised throughout the search area." The irony was devastating. The most technologically advanced military aviation assets in the world were being defeated by natural atmospheric conditions that rendered their sophisticated systems useless. The same electronic warfare resistance that made the F-35s nearly invulnerable to enemy countermeasures made them hypersensitive to the electromagnetic chaos generated by severe weather. Rodriguez turned toward the flight line where his remaining aircraft were stationed, his options rapidly narrowing as the clock ticked toward disaster for the missing civilian plane. His most capable pilots were flying aircraft that couldn't function in the search environment. His backup aircraft were smaller fighters designed for air-to-air combat rather than search and rescue operations. Then his gaze fell on the far end of the flight line where Sarah Kellerman's F-4 Phantom sat in its maintenance area, its older analog systems completely immune to the electromagnetic interference that was disabling his modern fleet. The aircraft that everyone had dismissed as obsolete suddenly represented the only technology on the base that could function effectively in the current crisis. Sarah stood quietly in the corner of the ready room, understanding exactly what was happening and knowing that her moment had finally arrived. 8 lives hung in the balance. Modern technology had failed catastrophically, and only the pilot everyone had written off possessed the equipment and skills necessary to succeed where advanced systems could not, the woman they'd refused to trust. With meaningful missions was about to become their only hope for preventing a disaster that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Sarah stepped forward from her corner position as Colonel Rodriguez stared helplessly at the communication displays showing his advanced aircraft failing in the electromagnetic storm. The static-filled voices of Webb and Torres reported continued system failures while somewhere in the desert, 8 people were running out of time and fuel. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos in the ready room. "Request permission to launch immediate search and rescue mission." Rodriguez turned toward her with an expression that mixed desperation with skepticism. "Colonel Kellerman, we've already established that aircraft systems are being compromised by electromagnetic interference. Your F-4 would face the same limitations as our other platforms." "No, sir, it wouldn't," Sarah replied, moving toward the equipment lockers where her flight gear waited. "My aircraft uses analog systems that are completely immune to electromagnetic interference. No computer-dependent navigation, no digital radar susceptible to false contacts, no GPS systems that can be disrupted by atmospheric conditions." Major Torres looked up from the communication console where she'd been monitoring the failed rescue attempts. "Colonel, even if your aircraft isn't affected by interference, you'd be flying blind without modern navigation systems. How would you locate a small civilian aircraft in hundreds of square miles of desert terrain?" Sarah was already pulling on her flight suit, her movements economical and practiced. The same way pilots found targets for 60 years before GPS was invented. Major, dead reckoning navigation, visual landmark recognition, and systematic search patterns based on fuel consumption calculations and wind drift analysis. "That's impossible," Captain Webb's voice crackled through the radio from his disabled F-35. "You can't search effectively without radar guidance. The weather conditions make visual searches completely impractical." Sarah secured her survival gear and grabbed her flight helmet, the same battered piece of equipment that had protected her through hundreds of combat missions. "Captain, I've conducted search and rescue operations in worse weather using nothing but compass headings and altitude references. Your problem isn't the weather, it's your dependence on technology that stops working when you need it most." "Colonel." Rodriguez found himself facing a decision that violated every principle of modern military doctrine. His most advanced aircraft had failed completely. His most experienced rescue coordinators were reporting mission failure, and his only remaining option was a pilot flying technology that predated most of his personnel's birth dates. "Kellerman, this is highly irregular. You don't have authorization for search and rescue operations. Your aircraft lacks the communication equipment for coordination with civilian authorities, and you'd be operating completely outside established emergency response protocols." Sarah paused at the ready room door, her hand on the handle. "Sir, 8 people are going to die while we debate protocols. My aircraft can fly in those conditions. I have the skills to navigate without electronic assistance, and I'm the only pilot on this base who's actually conducted successful SAR missions using manual navigation techniques." The radio crackled with another transmission from the failed rescue flight. "Ground control, Lightning flight. We're aborting search operations. Cannot maintain safe flight operations with continued system failures. Returning to base immediately. Sergeant. Santos looked up from her emergency coordination console with increasingly desperate updates. Sir, we've lost all communication with the civilian aircraft. Estimated fuel exhaustion in 22 minutes. No response from other SAR assets in the region due to weather-related equipment failures. Sarah opened the ready room door and stepped into the corridor leading to the flight line. I'm launching with or without authorization, sir. 8 lives are worth more than my career, and that aircraft sitting out there is the only thing on this base that can function in electromagnetic interference conditions. Rodriguez called after her, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility and institutional liability concerns. Colonel, if you launch without authorization, you'll face court-martial proceedings. This could end your military career permanently. My military career is already over, Sarah replied without breaking stride. They've made that clear enough. But those people in that aircraft still have a chance of someone with actual flying skills takes action instead of waiting for computers to solve the problem. She emerged onto the flight line where her F-4 Phantom waited in its maintenance area. The aircraft's analog systems and mechanical components representing 60 years of proven reliability. Unlike the disabled F-35s returning from their failed mission, her fighter had no electronic vulnerabilities that electromagnetic interference could exploit. Sarah's pre-flight inspection took exactly 90 seconds, her hands moving across familiar controls and systems that responded with mechanical precision rather than digital displays. Engine start procedures that required no computer assistance brought the twin Pratt and Whitney turbojets to life with their characteristic howl, a sound that had dominated military airfields since before electronic warfare was even conceptualized. She taxied toward the active runway. Sarah could see personnel gathering near the Flight Operations Center, watching her unauthorized departure with expressions ranging from concern to amazement. Colonel Rodriguez stood near the tower, speaking rapidly into his radio while gesturing toward her aircraft. Tower, Ghost requesting immediate departure clearance for emergency SAR mission. Sarah transmitted on the radio frequency reserved for base operations. The response came after a long pause filled with background conversations and administrative confusion. Ghost, you are not authorized for departure. Return to maintenance area immediately. Sarah advanced her throttles and began her takeoff roll without responding to the tower's command. Her F-4 accelerated down the runway with the authority of 40,000 pounds of thrust, lifting into the Nevada sky while modern fighters sat grounded by their technological vulnerabilities. As the base fell away beneath her, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft responding to pilot input rather than computer interpretation. Every control movement produced immediate, predictable results without electronic delay or digital processing. The Phantom climbed toward the electromagnetic storm that had defeated the most advanced military aircraft in the world. Its analog systems completely immune to the interference that had rendered newer technology useless. Her heading was set for the last known position of the missing civilian aircraft, calculated using navigation techniques that predated satellite guidance by decades. No GPS, no digital compass, no computer-assisted flight management, just a pilot, an aircraft, and the kind of flying skills that had guided military aviators through 6 decades of combat operations. The rescue mission, everyone said, was impossible. Had finally begun. The electromagnetic interference hit Sarah's F-4 Phantom at exactly 18,000 feet, manifesting as a subtle vibration in her radio equipment and minor fluctuations in her electrical systems. Unlike the catastrophic failures experienced by the F-35s, her aircraft's analog instruments continued functioning normally, their mechanical gauges and vacuum-driven systems completely unaffected by the atmospheric chaos that had defeated modern Avionics. Sarah switched off her radio to eliminate the static that was disrupting communication, relying instead on visual navigation techniques she'd mastered during combat missions over mountainous terrain in Afghanistan. The storm system ahead appeared as a massive wall of dark clouds shot through with electrical activity, the kind of weather that would ground commercial aviation, but represented merely another operational challenge for a pilot trained to fly. In combat conditions, her flight path followed a precise heading calculated from the civilian aircraft's last known position, adjusted for wind drift patterns and fuel consumption estimates based on the cetacean's typical performance characteristics. Without GPS guidance, Sarah navigated using landmark recognition and dead reckoning, identifying distinctive geographical features that appeared on her paper charts. Despite the deteriorating visibility conditions, the painted desert stretched endlessly below, its distinctive rock formations and carved canyons, providing navigation references that no electronic interference could disrupt. Sarah had studied this terrain during her early morning preparation sessions, memorizing the relationship between major landmarks and calculating search patterns that would maximize coverage while minimizing fuel consumption. At 12,000 feet, she encountered the severe turbulence that had forced the civilian aircraft into erratic flight patterns. The F-4 bucked and rolled through the unstable air mass, but Sarah's superior physical conditioning and decades of experience flying in adverse conditions allowed her to maintain precise aircraft control while scanning the desert landscape below. For any sign of the missing plane, her search technique followed systematic grid patterns developed during search and rescue operations in Southeast Asia, where pilots had located downed aircraft using visual scanning methods and mathematical probability calculations. Each search leg covered a specific corridor calculated to account for the citation's probable drift patterns given wind conditions and fuel constraints. 23 minutes into her search, Sarah spotted a glint of reflected sunlight from a metallic object approximately 6 miles northeast of her position. Banking sharply to investigate, she descended through the turbulent air while maintaining visual contact with what appeared to be an aircraft attempting to maintain level flight despite obvious control difficulties. The civilian citation was flying at barely 8,000 feet, significantly lower than normal cruise altitude, and indicating the pilot's attempt to escape the severe weather at higher elevations. The aircraft's flight path showed the erratic wobbling characteristic of manual flight without instrument reference, suggesting that the pilot was indeed flying blind through the electromagnetic interference. Sarah maneuvered her F-4 into a parallel course with the civilian aircraft, positioning herself where the citation's pilot could easily see her military fighter. She rocked her wings in the universal aviation signal for communication, a technique that predated radio contact by decades and remained effective. Regardless of electronic equipment failures, the citation's pilot responded by rocking his aircraft's wings, confirming visual contact and acknowledging Sarah's presence. Through her cockpit canopy, she could see the civilian pilot gesturing frantically, clearly indicating his desperate need for navigation assistance and landing guidance. Using hand signals and aircraft positioning, Sarah communicated her intention to provide navigation guidance to the nearest suitable airfield. Mercury Regional Airport lay 47 miles southeast of their current position, with runway facilities adequate for the citation's landing requirements and emergency services available for immediate medical assistance. The formation flight that followed required extraordinary piloting skill from both aircraft. Sarah had to maintain precise positioning that allowed the civilian pilot to follow her navigation while compensating for the turbulence and wind shear that threatened to separate the two aircraft. Her F-4's superior performance characteristics allowed her to slow to the citation's optimal airspeed while maintaining stable flight through the challenging atmospheric conditions. During the 38-minute flight to Mercury Regional, Sarah used traditional formation flying techniques to guide the civilian aircraft through the safest routing available given the weather conditions. She selected altitudes that minimized turbulence exposure, chose headings that avoided the worst electromagnetic interference, and maintained constant visual reference that gave the Citation's pilot confidence in the navigation guidance he was receiving. The approach to Mercury Regional required Sarah to demonstrate the full range of her flight skills. She positioned her F-4 to provide visual reference for the civilian pilot's landing approach, flying a parallel pattern that allowed the Citation to maintain proper glide slope and alignment, despite the absence of electronic landing aids. As the civilian aircraft touched down safely on the airport's main runway, Sarah executed a low pass over the field to verify the successful landing before climbing back to altitude for her return flight to Thunderbolt Air Force Base. The electromagnetic interference continued to affect her radio equipment, but her navigation back to base followed the same dead reckoning techniques that had guided the successful rescue mission, landing at Thunderbolt. 51 minutes after her unauthorized departure, Sarah taxied her F-4 toward the maintenance area, where Colonel Rodriguez and a significant gathering of base personnel waited with expressions ranging from relief to administrative concern. Her aircraft had performed flawlessly throughout the mission, its analog systems proving completely immune to the electromagnetic interference that had disabled more sophisticated platforms. As Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight procedures, radio confirmation arrived from Mercury Regional Airport that all 8 passengers and crew members from the civilian aircraft were safe and uninjured. She climbed out of her cockpit knowing that while she had saved 8 lives, her unauthorized departure would trigger the most serious administrative consequences of her military career. The institutional response to her success would determine whether competence and results mattered more than protocol and procedures in the modern Air Force. Colonel Rodriguez stood in the base commander's office 3 hours after Sarah's return, facing a conference call with General Patricia Hawkins and 2 officials from the Air Force Inspector General's office. The successful rescue mission had created an administrative nightmare that threatened to expose institutional failures at the highest levels of command. Colonel Rodriguez, General Hawkins began, her voice carrying the icy precision of an officer whose modernization policies had just been publicly contradicted by events. Explain to me how a pilot flying an obsolete aircraft succeeded in a mission where our most advanced fighters failed completely. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, acutely aware that his career advancement depended on his ability to frame Sarah's unauthorized action as an unfortunate breach of protocol rather than a demonstration of superior capability. General, Colonel Kellerman violated direct orders and launched without authorization. While the mission outcome was fortunate, her actions represent a serious breach of military discipline that cannot be overlooked. Lieutenant Colonel Janet Morrison from the Inspector General's office interrupted with a question that cut directly to the heart of the matter. Colonel Rodriguez, why wasn't Colonel Kellerman included in the initial rescue mission planning when her aircraft was the only platform on your base capable of operating effectively in electromagnetic interference conditions? Colonel Kellerman's aircraft lacks the modern communication and coordination systems required for complex rescue operations, Rodriguez replied, reciting the standard justification for excluding older aircraft from operational missions. Our F-35s were equipped with superior technology for search and rescue coordination. Technology that failed completely, Morrison observed dryly. Meanwhile, Colonel Kellerman's obsolete aircraft performed flawlessly throughout a mission that saved 8 civilian lives. This suggests a significant gap between your operational planning assumptions and actual mission requirements. The investigation had begun within hours of Sarah's return, triggered by the uncomfortable reality that the Air Force's most advanced aircraft had been defeated by weather conditions while an obsolete fighter had succeeded brilliantly. Colonel Thomas Patterson from the Inspector General's office had arrived at Thunderbolt the following morning with a team of investigators and a mandate to determine why institutional priorities had proven so catastrophically wrong. Patterson's first interview was with Master Sergeant David Kim, the senior air traffic controller who had monitored the entire rescue operation from the base tower. Kim's testimony provided a minute-by-minute account of the F-35's system failures and Sarah's successful mission execution. The Lightning flight was reporting complete radar failure, GPS malfunctions, and communication blackouts within 20 minutes of reaching the search area, Kim testified. Meanwhile, Colonel Kellerman maintained stable flight operations throughout the electromagnetic interference and successfully located the civilian aircraft using visual navigation techniques. In your professional opinion, Sergeant Kim, why weren't these navigation techniques considered during initial mission planning? Patterson asked. Kim hesitated before answering, clearly aware that his response could implicate his superior officers. Sir, the planning briefings focused exclusively on electronic search methods. Manual navigation techniques weren't discussed, because command assumed they were obsolete and unnecessary given our advanced avionics capabilities. The investigation team interviewed Chief Master Sergeant Park about maintenance priorities and resource allocation decisions that had systematically favored newer aircraft while limiting support for older platforms. Park's testimony revealed the institutional bias that had shaped operational readiness across the base. We were directed to prioritize maintenance schedules and parts procurement for F-35s and other modern aircraft, Park admitted under questioning. Older platforms like Colonel Kellerman's F-24 received minimal attention beyond basic airworthiness requirements. Did this maintenance prioritization affect the operational readiness of older aircraft? Morrison inquired. Not really, Park replied. Colonel Kellerman maintained her aircraft to standards that exceeded most pilots flying newer planes. She performed much of the routine maintenance herself and caught problems before they became serious issues. Her F-4 was actually one of the most reliable aircraft on the base. Patterson's interviews with younger pilots revealed the social and professional isolation that had been imposed on Sarah through unofficial but systematic exclusion from squadron activities. Captain Webb's testimony proved particularly damaging to the command structure's credibility. We were told that Colonel Kellerman's aircraft and flying techniques were obsolete, Webb admitted. Command emphasized that modern warfare required modern technology and that pilots using older methods weren't suitable for contemporary operations. Captain Webb, did anyone in your squadron question whether these older methods might have value in specific situations? Patterson asked. Webb's uncomfortable silence spoke volumes before he finally responded. No, sir. We assumed that if the techniques were valuable, they would have been included in our training programs. Major Torres's interview revealed the systematic nature of the discrimination that had shaped Sarah's assignments and evaluations. Under persistent questioning, Torres acknowledged that Sarah had been deliberately excluded from challenging missions despite her superior qualifications. Colonel Kellerman's experience level exceeded that of most pilots in the squadron, Torres conceded. However, our mission assignments prioritized technology compatibility over pilot experience. Major Torres, are you aware that Colonel Kellerman predicted the electromagnetic interference problems that disabled your F-35s during the training exercise 3 weeks ago? Morrison asked. Torres shifted nervously. She raised some concerns about atmospheric conditions, but our meteorological analysis software indicated that modern avionics could compensate for any interference. Software that proved incorrect while her prediction proved accurate, Patterson noted. Was Colonel Kellerman's warning documented in the official exercise records? No, sir. Her concerns were considered overly cautious and potentially disruptive to pilot confidence. The most damaging testimony came from Sergeant Santos, who had monitored communications during both the failed training exercise and the successful rescue mission. Her detailed logs showed that Sarah's warnings about electromagnetic interference had been consistently dismissed despite their subsequent accuracy. Colonel Kellerman identified the exact altitude ranges and atmospheric conditions that would cause system failures, Santos testified. Her predictions were completely accurate, but Command chose to proceed with missions based on computer models rather than her experience-based analysis. Colonel Patterson's final interview was with Colonel Rodriguez himself, whose explanations for Sarah's marginalization became increasingly difficult to defend under methodical questioning. Rodriguez's attempts to justify institutional decisions crumbled when confronted with documented evidence of systematic discrimination. Colonel Rodriguez, your personnel records show that Colonel Kellerman received consistently excellent ratings for flying skills and technical knowledge, while receiving poor evaluations for modernization adaptability, Patterson observed. Can you explain how a pilot who successfully completed a rescue mission that defeated your most advanced aircraft could be rated as poorly adapted to modern operations? Rodriguez's stammering response revealed the fundamental contradiction in Air Force policy. The institution was systematically eliminating its most capable pilots in favor of technology dependence that had proven catastrophically inadequate when conditions exceeded computer models. The investigation was exposing not just individual prejudice, but institutional failures that threatened the entire foundation of modern military aviation doctrine. The final report from the Inspector General's investigation landed on the desk of Secretary of the Air Force Margaret Chen on a Monday morning. In late April, containing findings that would reshape personnel policies across the entire service, the document's executive summary presented a damning indictment of institutional failures that had nearly cost 8 civilian lives and revealed systematic discrimination that violated both military regulations and basic principles of operational effectiveness. Secretary Chen convened an emergency review board within 48 hours of receiving the report, bringing together senior leadership from across the Air Force to address what the investigation had characterized as a comprehensive failure of leadership judgment and operational priorities. The meeting took place in the Pentagon's secure conference room, with participants attending both in person and via encrypted video link from bases worldwide. This investigation reveals institutional biases that have compromised our operational readiness and violated our fundamental obligation to maximize military effectiveness, Chen announced to the assembled leadership. We have systematically marginalized our most experienced pilots in favor of technological dependence that has proven inadequate under real-world conditions. General Patricia Hawkins sat at the conference table, her modernization policies now exposed as dangerously short-sighted. The investigation had documented how her emphasis on technology over experience had created blind spots in Air Force capabilities that could have resulted in catastrophic mission failures during actual combat operations. The evidence shows that Colonel Kellerman possessed exactly the skills and experience necessary for the rescue mission, yet was systematically excluded from operational assignments due to prejudice against older aircraft and traditional flying techniques. Chen continued. Meanwhile, pilots flying advanced aircraft failed completely when their technological advantages were neutralized by environmental conditions. The disciplinary actions began immediately. Colonel Rodriguez was relieved of command at Thunderbolt Air Force Base and reassigned to a desk position at Air Force Material Command, effectively ending his career advancement prospects. His fitness reports would reflect his failure to recognize and utilize the capabilities of experienced personnel under his command, ensuring that his leadership failures followed him for the remainder of his military service. Major Torres faced more severe consequences. Her role in systematically excluding Sarah from operational missions while documenting false justifications for discrimination resulted in formal reprimand and removal. from consideration for promotion to lieutenant colonel. The investigation had uncovered emails and documentation showing deliberate manipulation of assignment processes to marginalize experienced pilots, evidence that would permanently damage her career prospects. Captain Webb's punishment reflected both his discriminatory behavior and his failure to learn from the electromagnetic interference incident that had exposed his technological overconfidence. He was reassigned to transport duty flying cargo missions, removed from fighter aircraft operations, and required to complete additional training on manual navigation and basic flying skills. Before returning to tactical assignments, General Hawkins faced the most significant professional consequences. Her aggressive modernization policies and dismissal of experienced pilots' warnings had created operational vulnerabilities that the investigation characterized as threats to national security. She was reassigned from her position overseeing pilot training and aircraft procurement to a ceremonial role coordinating Air Force historical programs, a clear signal that her influence over operational policy had ended permanently. Sarah received notification of her vindication through a personal phone call from Secretary Chun, who apologized on behalf of the Air Force for the discrimination she had endured and announced her immediate promotion to full colonel with retroactive benefits and pay adjustments. More significantly, she was offered command of the newly created Advanced Combat Training Squadron at Nellis Air Force Base, a position specifically designed to integrate traditional flying skills with modern technology. The Secretary's announcement included the establishment of the Kellerman Doctrine, a comprehensive policy requiring that all Air Force pilots receive training in manual navigation, analog instrument flying, and combat operations without electronic assistance. The doctrine recognized that technological advantages could be neutralized by enemy action or environmental conditions, making traditional flying skills essential for operational effectiveness. Colonel Kellerman's successful rescue mission demonstrated that pilot skill and experience remain crucial factors in military aviation. Chun explained during the policy announcement, "We cannot allow technological dependence to replace the fundamental flying abilities that have defined aviation excellence for over a century." Sarah's new command included responsibility for developing curriculum that would train modern pilots in the traditional techniques that had enabled her rescue mission success. The Advanced Combat Training Squadron would operate both modern aircraft and older platforms, ensuring that pilots understood the relationship between technological capability and fundamental flying skills. Her first official act as squadron commander was establishing the Experience Integration Program, designed to pair veteran pilots with younger aviators for mutual skill development. The program recognized that modern technology and traditional techniques could enhance each other rather than competing for relevance in contemporary military operations. The investigation's findings prompted broader changes across the Air Force. Personnel system. Performance evaluation criteria were modified to emphasize problem-solving ability and adaptability, rather than technological proficiency alone. Assignment processes were restructured to ensure that experience and judgment received equal consideration with modern training credentials. Base commanders received new directives requiring them to maintain operational diversity in their aircraft fleets and pilot assignments. The systematic preference for newer platforms that had characterized recent policy was replaced by requirements to preserve institutional knowledge and maintain capabilities across the full spectrum of operational conditions. Sarah's assignment to Nellis included oversight of the Air Force's most challenging training programs, where she would evaluate pilot candidates for advanced combat roles. Her selection criteria emphasized the combination of technical proficiency and fundamental flying skills that had enabled her rescue mission success. The civilian rescue that had triggered the investigation became a case study taught at the Air Force Academy and throughout pilot training programs. Students learned how technological dependence had created mission failure, While traditional skills had enabled success under challenging conditions that exceeded computer modeling capabilities, Sarah's office at Nellis displayed her original F-4 Phantom flight helmet alongside awards recognizing her rescue mission achievement. But her greatest satisfaction came from working with young pilots who were eager to learn the skills that institutional prejudice had nearly eliminated from Air Force operations. During her first squadron meeting, Sarah addressed 43 pilots from across the service who had been selected for advanced combat training that integrated traditional and modern techniques. Her opening remarks reflected the lessons learned from years of discrimination and the ultimate vindication that had proven experience and technology could work together, rather than in opposition. Excellence in military aviation requires mastering every tool available, from the most advanced computers to the most basic compass headings, she told her new command. Our job is to be better than our aircraft, not dependent on them. We're going to train pilots who can succeed when technology fails, when computers crash, and when the only thing standing between mission success and disaster is superior flying skill. The woman they had refused to trust with wings had become the pilot responsible for ensuring that future generations would never face the technological helplessness that had nearly cost 8 civilian lives. Her victory was complete, but more importantly, it was transformational. 5 years later, Colonel Sarah Kellerman stood on the observation deck at Nellis Air Force Base, watching the formation of 6 aircraft conduct training exercises over the Nevada desert. The flight included both modern F-35 Lightning IIs and restored F-4 Phantoms, their pilots demonstrating the integrated combat techniques that had become the gold standard for military aviation training worldwide. Captain Marcus Webb approached from behind. His attitude transformed from the arrogant young pilot who had once mocked her obsolete aircraft. Now a graduate of Sarah's advanced combat training squadron, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from mastering both cutting-edge technology and fundamental flying skills. Colonel, the international delegation from NATO Air Forces wants to observe tomorrow's electromagnetic interference training exercise, Webb reported. They're particularly interested in our manual navigation techniques and analog backup procedures. Sarah smiled, remembering the days when such skills were dismissed as worthless relics. Tell them they're welcome to observe, Captain. Make sure they understand that what we're teaching here isn't about choosing between old and new, it's about being prepared for anything. The Kellerman Doctrine had spread beyond the U.S. Air Force, adopted by military aviation programs across the globe. Pilots now trained to excel with or without technological advantages, understanding that true aviation mastery required the ability to succeed when computers failed and only human skill remained. As the sun set over the desert where she had once conducted her unauthorized rescue mission, Sarah reflected on how being underestimated had ultimately led to transforming an entire military culture. The woman they wouldn't let fly had taught the world that experience and technology together created capabilities neither could achieve alone. Her legacy soared through every pilot who understood that the sky belonged to those skilled enough to claim it, regardless of the aircraft they flew. What incredible story of overlooked talent would you like to hear next? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of underdogs who changed everything.